Good morning and welcome to the Point. The state legislature is on summer break, but it doesn't mean that the legislators don't still have work to do. And of course, there is always the rehash of what just happened in Lansing. This morning, we'll talk to two state representatives, one Republican and one Democrat, to get their take on what the legislature has accomplished so far this year and what's left to be done. We start with Walker Republican Representative Rob VerHeulen. Representative, let's start with the session that has been recessed for now, for a little time during the summer. What got accomplished in the first few months of this year? I mean, Republicans have made much of the sixth year in a row that they got budgets done early in comparison to when they're due in the 1st of October, but certainly early in comparison to what they were getting done in the mid-2000s. What was the budget process like, and what's your take on it?
Well, I think it went remarkably well. Once again, for the sixth year, we were able to get it done early, first week of June. And it really is significant. It's not just something for bragging rights for our local school districts, for local units of government. It's vital that they know what amount of money and what amount of funding they're going to receive. So it really is an important thing to get done in a timely fashion, and we were able to do that. And this year it was made more complex by the revenue estimating conference, which revised downward our projected revenues. So that meant, even though we'd done budgets in the House and the Senate, we had to go back to the drawing board to make sure that the expenditures meshed with the projected revenues, and so that complicated the process. But I'm proud to say we were able to do it in a timely fashion. And of course, I have the largest budget in the full budget, the Department of Health and Human Services. So I'm particularly pleased that we were able to work through that in a positive way, and we're able to achieve our priorities, but yet balance the budget. And in fact, overall spending was less than the rate of inflation, which is I think a very positive thing.
Particularly given that inflation is almost non-existent in this economy, so the increase was relatively small. However, even with the downward estimation of revenue, it's still a rounding error short of $55 billion. It's a lot of money to be dealt with. Your budget alone is a big chunk of that. How big?
It is. It's approximately $25 billion, so it's not quite half of the total budget, but it's pretty close, and it's far and away the largest individual budget.
Talk to us a little bit about where that money goes, because when you talk about $25 billion in one combined department, people will say, well, what is that paying for? For some, they know. Others,
well, I think the largest single component is the Medicaid program, and then there are the various programs for the aging, what was traditionally Department of Human Services, welfare, bridge cards, assistance to the nursing homes, hospitals, graduate medical education. So it's a huge budget with it touches every one of our lives.
And there's a lot of federal money in that budget.
A lot of federal money, yes.
So just so people understand, by the way, if you go to House Fiscal, go to budget briefings on the web, there are great breakdowns of the budget. It shows you where the money comes from and where the money goes, and it's really a good way to educate yourself about those big budgets. What else were you working on? I know Detroit Public Schools became, in the late hours, a contentious issue. It had been one that one of your colleagues from Hart over in the Senate, Jeff Hansen, had been working on for months and months and months. There was some buy-in from the folks over in Detroit. At the end, that didn't all go down as smoothly as some would have hoped.
No, it didn't. It didn't, and I think a lot of it related to the Detroit Education Commission, which the mayor of Detroit was a strong advocate for. But there was a concern that it would put the charter schools at a significant disadvantage. But despite that, I think it's and I've heard people say, well, to think that a Republican legislature would be providing that kind of funding for the city of Detroit or Detroit Public Schools is an incredible feat, and it was. It was unfortunately not a bipartisan solution. It was all Republicans in the House, and I think that's unfortunate. But yet I think it was a good package. I think we're turning over control. There'll be elections this year yet. And one of the key points for me, and I think many of my colleagues, was the presence of the Financial Review Commission, so that financial decisions that are made by the school authorities will be reviewed by an independent body. And that is something that we put in place when we did the Detroit, the grand bargain in Detroit. And I've talked to the mayor, and it's kind of interesting because I asked him, I said, well, and I was a mayor, and I said I wouldn't want my financial decisions reviewed by an independent body. I'd like to do it myself. But he said it's really been a help in managing the city of Detroit finances. And it seems, it's very early in the process, but it seems to be working well, and so I'm very happy to see it in Detroit Public Schools as well.
You were mayor of Walker for 11 years?
11 years.
Okay, so just so when you say you were mayor, so people know where you were mayor. Let's talk about that, though, in Detroit, because there have been some really big changes. I mean, the bankruptcy, the grand bargain. We talk about those two things kind of offhandedly now, but that was a dynamic change in the way that the state looked at the city of Detroit and the way the government in the city of Detroit started looking at itself. We were up on Mackinac Island for the Detroit Regional Chamber a few weeks ago, and I was doing a forum with the governor, and I mentioned the bankruptcy, and I think I did almost offhandedly. He said, well, you got through the bankruptcy, and he stopped me and said, wait, I was kind of the lone wolf on this when this started. There were a whole lot of people that said that wasn't going to work. Looking backwards and seeing the progress that's been made, it is his take that it worked pretty well. Is that your take?
It is. I think there are a host of challenges in the city of Detroit, but I think they're making positive steps in the right direction. And I think one of the missing elements is a solid, financially stable school district. So I'm hoping that the assistance that we're providing from the package we did last week will do that. Will generate stability in the system, and it's the demographics and the numbers are staggering. The reduction in size, number of students in Detroit Public Schools, and the mayor, rightly in my view, wants to assure the parents that we will provide a quality education in a good facility, and stop the fleeing numbers. And it's hard to operate any school district, even in a suburban area where the student count goes down so rapidly, because the funding is tied, the foundation allowance, the amount of money they receive from the state is linked to their student population. So I am hopeful that this will give them it will be a catalyst for their stopping the flow and actually becoming a stronger system. And of course, we sometimes forget that we're doing all of this for the students, for the children. It isn't just money. It isn't. We have both an obligation constitutionally and morally to provide a quality education for these youngsters. And so I'm hoping that this will be the beginning of an upward swing for the Detroit Public Schools.
One of the things I didn't mention a minute ago when we were talking about budgets is that for school districts, their budgets start in July. And so getting the budgets done that you did early on help all school districts. But in talking about budgeting, and we talk about 618 million, whatever it is, that will go over the next decade into the Detroit Public Schools. That is not the school aid fund that is going to be funding that. And I think it's an important point to make, because while it is certainly tax money, it's taxpayer money, it's not coming out of the school aid fund, and then as a technical matter should not affect your local school in Comstock Park or in Rockford or in Grand Rapids.
No, that's absolutely right. The entire funding package, and actually it's prohibited from using school aid funds to meet our financial obligation. So it will not impact the local schools, the other schools in Michigan at all, which excuse me, is in great contrast to, there were certain folks that said, well, let them go bankrupt. Well, then a federal bankruptcy judge would be making those decisions, and we don't know whether he or she would want to protect the school aid fund for the other districts. And in my view, the total cost to every taxpayer in Michigan would be significantly higher. So it's never a happy occasion when you're put in a position where you have to make those kind of huge economic decisions, but given the facts and the alternatives, I think we made the right one, and I'm pleased. And I wanted to make sure that we did it now, because parents are making that decision. Are we going to re-enroll our students in Detroit Public Schools, or are we going to look for an alternative? And now the parents know that the funding is in place. There'll be elections, there'll be a local school board, And hopefully that the fact that those decisions were made will allow the parents to make good decisions for their children.
So for a few weeks this summer, the legislature will not meet or meet very limitedly, and there are still a lot of big items out there that haven't been done. At the very end of the session, there was even talk about some changes to no fault, not the whole rewrite that we have heard about, but some technical changes, but those differed from the House and the Senate, so that ended up not getting done.
Right.
I assume we might see something on that in the fall if the House agrees with the Senate or wants to change that.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. And I think if there were more time before session ended, we probably would have taken a look at what the Senate did. As part of the budget process, the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House, and the Governor agreed that to make the budget work, we had to repeal a tax credit given to no-fault carriers. And I wasn't there at the time, but everything I've learned is that it was an unintended consequence. That wasn't what they were trying to do. It just resulted in a credit that the no-fault carriers weren't asking for and didn't anticipate, and certainly the legislature didn't mean to give the credit.
But if it was there, they were going to take it.
Absolutely. So as part of, because of the reduced sales tax revenues, the decision was made that we're not going to take the money out of the school aid fund, we're not going to take the money out of this program or that, we're going to repeal that credit. And so that was critical that we had that done before adoption of the budget. And then as part of that, there were some reforms that were proposed, and I think we just needed more time to vet those, to take a look at them. Are they good? Are they bad? Can they be improved on? So the Senate did a bill and sent it over to the House, but it was there wasn't time. And I think if we had been forced to vote on it, I think most legislators are like me. I want to analyze it. I want to understand it. And if you're forcing me to make a decision before I'm ready, I'm going to vote no. And so I think the Speaker made the right choice to put it off until the fall. It'll still be there, and I'm sure we'll take a look at it. And then we have time over the course of the next few weeks to look at it and talk about it.
There's the perspective from one Republican in the House of Representatives, and of course the Democrats have a view of things too. You'll hear that when we return next to The Point. Welcome back to The Point. As we pointed out earlier, the state legislature is in recess for the summer, but there's a lot of work to be done this fall. One of the issues that Grand Rapids Democrat Winnie Brinks is concerned with is the home for veterans in Grand Rapids, and we talked about that. Representative, let's talk about this legislative session. It's not over. Obviously, you'll be back in the fall, but for the summertime, there'll be a break. So tell me what got done. One of the things we know is that there was some big effort in Lansing to look closer at the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans. It's been something that you've been interested in, obviously, from an area you represent. What's going on at that home, and what should we be looking at?
So we've heard a lot of testimony now about two really horrific audits that were conducted in the last couple of years on conditions in the home, as well as the quality or lack of quality of caregiving there. So it's been a real slow movement in the right direction, I believe. We did pass some legislation to establish an ombudsman for the home this past week, which is something I've been working on for my entire time in the legislature. So I was really glad to see that pass. But we heard 6 hours of testimony on Monday at the veterans home itself. I think there were about 30 veterans or family members who came to speak, and there still continue to be problems with the caregiving there. So I'm a little disheartened with that. So I'm hoping that we'll finally be in a position where we can see some actual action on this instead of just more reports and more hearings.
We have heard a lot over the past few years about the VA, which is separate. This is a state facility.
Right.
Albeit there may be federal money involved, but this is a state-run facility. There are two of them in the entire state. I have been doing stories out at the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans for a decade, at least. Why can't we get that right? What is the problem?
That's a really good question. We've got a situation in the last 3 years where it's gotten even worse than it was previously, from what I can tell from reports from the residents that have been there for many years. So I think that's the immediate question before us, is how to take care of that. And 3 years ago is when they privatized the direct care workers. To me, that's something that could easily be addressed. It was done to save money and to theoretically improve care. We certainly have not seen an improvement in care, and I have yet to see convincing evidence that we've saved money. So even if we have saved money, I would add, at what cost? How many millions of dollars is it worth? If you've heard some of the testimony and seen some of the photos of the things that have happened to the veterans there, it's really unfortunate that we've got a Republican legislature that continues to double down on their ideas about privatization, despite the evidence that it's really not working at the veterans' home.
Is that really the problem? Is it really privatization? I mean, there were problems before.
Sure.
And there are problems now. You say they've gotten worse, but I guess my question is still my original question. Why can't we get it right? I mean, whether it's privatized, whether it's not privatized, it seems to me that there are people all over the country that are running homes for people who need that kind of care.
Right.
That seem to have figured it out.
You're absolutely right. We should be able to do better. One, I think, thing that will help is that we have an ombudsman now assigned to there. So there's somebody looking out for things. In the past, we have not had a real watchdog there. It's been the department and the veterans home keeping track of its own infractions, and so that obviously does not work. So that has changed somewhat, and I think that if we could improve the direct care workers, in addition to some of that improvement in oversight that we're starting to see, I think that we'd be moving in the right direction. But that's going to require that's going to require the legislature to take action, and it appears that they're unwilling to change direction at this point on something as major as the caregiving. I just don't think it's worth continuing down this road if we have to sacrifice the dignity of our veterans to do so.
There is one other big change that's taken place, and the new director that oversees the whole thing is from Grand Rapids. Former judge Jim Redford is now there, and he has said on a number of occasions, because he came in after the fact, he was literally sitting on the bench when all of these problems were going on, that he wants to try to get to the bottom of it. Does it help to have a fresh set of eyes on the problem?
I think it definitely helps. I've seen some positive movement since he's been in charge. We've seen significant change in the leadership at the home under him as well, and I think that has been key. That sets the tone, and it's somebody who's got a great resume in providing care in other facilities. She knows the standards, and she knows how to make the changes that are required to see the improvement there. But unless she's got the tools from the legislature, adequate resources, and the ability to do what she knows needs to be done, we won't succeed there.
You and your colleagues voted on about $55 billion of spending to start October 1st. Actually, some of it starts in July for schools, but the budgets are done. They got done in order. In other words, in the past few years, it has been the practice of the legislature to try to get them done much earlier than it had been done in the mid-2000s. A lot of things working in your favor on that. The economy is far better. There's enough money to actually make a budget, which was not true in some of those other years. What's your grade on the budget when it all gets done? Because there are always differences in how the priorities should be represented by spending.
Absolutely. So, the budget had some good stuff and some bad stuff in it. And the way we pass budgets now, of course, we roll them all together. Right. So we don't vote on each individual department budget, or we don't divide it up, except into the school bus and to the general fund
and the omnibus.
budget.
And let's explain that a little bit. It used to be the 14 separate budgets, something like that, and they would
like
all be voted on individually. So you would get, each of these budgets would come up. Now they've rolled them all up into the omnibus bill, and then the separate spending is the school aid fund, which is kept separate. So that is a much different process.
Yeah, so it's a much different process than the old days. But I'll say this: there were some great things that I did vote yes on the budgets, and I was really pleased to see Grand Rapids schools get the maximum amount that we were allocating, increasing for K through 12 schools of all the school districts in the state. So they're at the top of that. So it was best case scenario in this budget for them. So I was very glad to support that. We also had funding in there for the Veterans Home Ombudsman, not in the school bus, of course, but in the other budget, and very pleased to be able to support that. There's some additional dollars in there for the Veterans Home as well. We've also got capital outlay expenditure for Grand Rapids Community College. So those are all investments that I was glad to be able to support in this budget. There are a few other things that I think are unfortunate. We've left some large amount of federal money on the table for a program called Heat and Eat, where folks who are eligible for food assistance and heat assistance, if we had allocated about $3 million more to that, we would have been able to draw down about $140 million federal dollars. So these are dollars that would go to mostly elderly and disabled folks who are on assistance. So it's unfortunate that we can't sort of see through a relatively small expenditure to be able to leverage that kind of dollars.
And before I get a call from Al Pashoka, each of these budgets is voted on individually in the budget process.
Correct.
By those committees. So
By
it's
those
not
committees.
as if they're not dealt with. It's just that they're not voted
Right.
on by the entire body
Exactly.
individually.
Right.
So that'll save him a call on
There
Sunday
you go.
morning.
There you go.
Let's talk about another big expenditure that I think left a lot of people with some really hurt feelings, but a glimmer of optimism because at least there was some movement. That's Detroit Public Schools. It started off, my words, not yours, as a process that looked like there was a lot of thought going into it and a lot of people were getting on board. But by the time the thing came down to a vote, it didn't pick up any bipartisan support. And your take on that is?
Right. Well, you've characterized that well. We had a solution that was passed through the Senate earlier that had the support of the governor, it had the support of House Democrats, it had the support of Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans, of course, and it had the support of many stakeholders, the mayor of Detroit, for instance, a group in Detroit that's been talking about the future of Detroit public schools for a long time now. They weighed in and they were in support of it. So we had a plan originally that many of us wanted to see passed. The House Republicans were the lone voice against that, and in the end, they really kind of just held the whole process hostage until they got what they want. And we needed to do something, and so they certainly leveraged the urgency of the situation to do something that most of us believe was not really sufficient. The Senate Republicans then kind of caved into the House Republicans, and now they can all go home and say they did something, but my concern is that in the end, what we did was not adequate for helping out the Detroit Public Schools in a really meaningful way. We needed to have additional reforms in there. There needed to be a rational way to help every student in Detroit have access to a high quality school, whether that's a charter school or a traditional public school. And there needed to be reinvestment in teachers and certified teachers there, and instead we've gone the other way and they're allowing uncertified teachers to be teaching those kids who really need more help than many of the rest of the children and throughout the rest of the state. So to me, we've got there's a solution out there, but I don't think it's adequate for what Detroit really needs.
One of the things, and we talked earlier in the show with Representative VerHeulen, one of the things that was done is the money is separate from the school aid fund, which most everyone seemed to think was the proper way to do it. But in the plan that was ultimately passed, it's about $100 million less than the original plan that you spoke of over in the Senate. And that is money used to retire debt from what will become two school districts. One won't have anything to do with education, it'll have to do with dealing with the debt, right? And that's where the money will go. And then the school aid fund will fund the other. But if that's $100 million short, what happens to that $100 million gap?
That's a very good question, right? I think that we're going to have to see how they implement that over there in Detroit, and they have an emergency manager in place there that's continuing to try and wrestle with that. They were concerned that the dollars that were allocated in this last vote was not enough. So really what we need to have happen is an audit so that we get a better idea of what the true needs are. It's a big, huge system. There's a lot of questions that are unanswered. There's a lot of things that most of us don't know about where all the money needs to go, should go, and without sort of doing a forensic audit of the whole situation, I'm not sure that we'll have a great grasp of what that whole number should have been. There seems to be consensus that the number allocated is probably not enough. So we'll just have to find out by trial and error. So that $100 million, your guess is as good as mine.
We'll be back with a final note next. To the point. Well, as you all know, there's a big presidential election going on, but there's also a lot of races going on for the House of Representatives. Starting next week, we'll introduce you to some of the primary candidates when you join us next and every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock for To the Point.